There's many ways to play Pokemon games, some of which are great and some of which aren't so great. As somebody who is always either playing Pokemon or making a video about playing Pokemon, I figured I'd make a tier list based on which consoles are the best to play main series Pokemon games on. So let me set up the whiteboard and start yapping. Released in the year of our Lord, 1989, on the original Game Boy you can play red, blue, or yellow with no color. I started with the Game Boy Color as a kid, and I didn't even know the original Game Boy existed until I went over to a friend's house and his older brother had this weird blocky Game Boy. And my Game Boy is now a microphone. It's actually not even like a bit or a joke, I actually have the microphone attached to the back of this thing. The original Game Boy is big, bulky, and ugly just like your mother, while also needing 4 AA batteries for a tiny screen with a weird green hue with no backlight. The no backlight thing is a very common theme with these older Nintendo consoles, and while it did introduce us to Pokemon, you can only play Gen 1, and there's so many better ways to play Gen 1 Pokemon games. There's really no reason to pick the original Game Boy over just about any other way to play a Gen 1 or 2 Pokemon game, so with that in mind, it's going in F tier. Okay, so I'm not going to be super unhinged and like tape all these consoles to the whiteboard because they're going to fall and they're expensive, but I printed them out, and they're really small, and also not in color. Bear with me, chat. Turn it on, you're in the way. I actually don't have one of these original Game Boys, so I guess this tier list is flawed because I don't have all these consoles. But you can't tell me this is the best way to play a Pokemon game. It's just not. Then in 1996, they released an updated version of the Game Boy Pocket, which can now actually fit in your pocket. Most of the improvements come from the smaller form factor, but it also only takes 2 AA batteries versus 4. Older models didn't have a light to indicate the battery levels, but later models of the Game Boy Pocket added that back. It is technically better than the original Game Boy, but really not by much. I'd take the Pocket over the original Game Boy any day, so I guess I'll stick it at the bottom of D tier, mainly because it's still not in color and still does have a backlight, but is just slightly better than the original Game Boy. Game Boy's biggest competitors at the time, like the Sega Game Gear, even had a backlight, making them a bit nicer to play compared to the original Game Boy because you could actually see your screen. I'm not holding the microphone because you could actually see your screen. But they did release a Game Boy Pocket model with a light called the Game Boy Light, which was exclusive to Japan. And I have to say, this is one of the coolest Game Boys they've ever made. I remember first hearing about these about 10 years ago or so and wanted to get one, but never did. It's a Game Boy Pocket, still in black and white, but act as an awkward middle step between the Game Boy Pocket and the Game Boy Color. This one's hard to rate because although it's cool as heck and has a backlight, the Game Boy Color released shortly after, so you have to ask yourself, would you rather play with a backlit screen or would you rather play in color? The Game Boy Color can also play Pokemon Crystal, which the Game Boy Pocket can't, or the Game Boy Light can't either. And we have so many consoles that I prefer over the Pocket and the Light still, and while it is cool having this backlight, it's still not the best way to play Pokemon, and yeah, I'm just gonna put it in the D tier with the other Game Boys. I would still love to get one someday. Same with like an original Game Boy, I just don't have one. It just, sometimes at game stores you see them for like over $100, and I'm like, why? And then sometimes you see them like really beat up for like 20 bucks. I'm gonna move the regular Pocket over and put the Light Pocket in front of it. And now we have the Game Boy Color, which also acts as a microphone in my case, which we discussed a little bit already. It unfortunately doesn't have a backlit screen, and if it did, it would rank much higher. Finally being able to play in color is great, although for red and blue, everything is just in a shade of red or blue depending on what version you're playing. You don't really see real color on the Game Boy Color until yellow version and later on with gold, silver, and crystal, which just look so much better compared to the original Game Boy. I have a custom Game Boy Color that has USB-C charging and a backlight and a bigger screen, which I absolutely love using, but we're only going to be ranking official Nintendo release consoles today and not other ways that you can play these games. For the original Game Boy line though, I would say the Game Boy Color is the best way to play cartridge copies of Generation 1 and 2 Pokemon games on their intended consoles, a bit specific, so I'll put them at the top of D tier. Okay, now I gotta move them all over. There we go. Not a great start for the Game Boy line, but that's mainly because they're so old and there's just so many better ways to play Pokemon now. I'll take this time to remind you guys to leave a like if you want to support the channel and subscribe, and if you don't, I'll start showing that graph of people who watch but don't subscribe or like, which is like over 70% of you. What's up with that? We're not quite done with all the Game Boy Pokemon games though, although we did run through all of the handheld consoles for the original Game Boy line. There's 2 more ways you could technically play Gen 1 and 2 Pokemon cartridges on, starting with the Super Game Boy for the Super Nintendo. All you do is take your Pokemon game, put it into the Super Game Boy cartridge, then put that in the Super Nintendo, turn it on, and wow, you have Game Boy games on your TV. This was a really cool way to play Game Boy games on your TV back then, and you could even play in color. The music was enhanced because it was running on a console and using TV speakers, and has some extra features like borders around your game, with the only downside being that there was no port to connect and trade Pokemon with. I'm a big fan of being able to play my handheld games on a bigger screen like a TV, and while there are improvements upon playing it on a TV versus a handheld, there's still some trade-offs with it. I'm gonna put the Super Game Boy in D tier right by the Game Boy Color because I honestly don't know if it's slightly better than the Game Boy Color or slightly worse. I also don't have one, so take that with a pinch of salt. Is this the Super Nintendo? I think this is the Super Nintendo. Why did I print these out so small? I don't know. You know what we can do? We can put them like this. One on top of the other. Now you could also play your Gen 1 and 2 Pokemon games on the Nintendo 64. Was I even pointing at it? I can't really see. This was my first experience playing Game Boy games on a TV as a kid, and I loved it. I remember not liking how it was only for Pokemon games, but that doesn't really matter for the context of this video, as we're only discussing Pokemon games and nothing else. You could play the Gen 1 Pokemon games on Stadium 1 in full color, but to play the Gen 2 games you need Pokemon Stadium 2. Stadium 2 also allows you to play the Gen 1 games as well, so I guess you don't really need Stadium 1 at all if you just care about playing your Game Boy Pokemon games on your TV, and if you don't want to do it through a Super Nintendo. It was a bit cumbersome to set up though, since you needed to hook up the transfer pack to your controller, then put the game into the transfer pack. This added weight to the controller, which made it feel really weird, especially in the center, which makes it a bit awkward to hold. The transfer pack wasn't perfect too, and if you set your controller on a table, it will sometimes freeze the game or pop out the cartridge a little bit. It's not the best, but there's a feature that makes up for a lot of the negatives, and it's Doduo. Or Dodrio as well, I guess. But in the Game Boy Tower of Pokemon Stadium, Doduo mode lets you play at 2 times speed, while Dodrio mode lets you play at a whopping 3 times speed. This is amazing because one of my biggest issues with the Gen 1 and 2 Pokemon games was how slow they feel to move around compared to some of the newer games, mainly because of the lack of running shoes, and this fixes a lot of that. Sort of. In Stadium 1, you unlock Doduo mode after you beat all the Poke Cup tournaments. Then you unlock Dodrio mode by beating the Prime Cup after beating the Poke Cup. It's a bit tedious and takes a little while to set up, and I wish I knew about this when I did the Professor Oak's challenge video on Yellow version, as it would have saved me probably like 20 hours or so of gameplay. But in Stadium 2, things are a bit different for the Doduo and Dodrio mode. For Doduo and Dodrio modes to work in the Gen 2 games, in Gold, Silver, and Crystal, you have to beat the Elite Four. While it can be used for faster shiny hunting or going through the battle tower quicker, the main draw to Doduo and Dodrio mode is to play through the main story faster, which you just can't do with the Gen 2 games. There is a slight workaround there. If you beat the Elite Four, then start up a new copy of your game on Stadium 2 in Doduo mode or Dodrio mode, it will stay sped up. But once you save and close your game and return to it, you won't be able to do Doduo or Dodrio mode anymore. For Generation 1, I think this is one of the best way to play those games, while for Gen 2, it's really not that nice. There are some flaws with playing on an N64, and it's not terrible, and the speed up on official hardware alone for Gen 1 especially is enough for me to want to put the N64 in C tier. Also, this is a lot of nostalgia because I played Yellow version a ton as a kid on my N64. And yes, I still didn't know about Doduo or Dodrio mode until like less than a year ago. You know what, I'm gonna be smart with this microphone. I want to just clip it to myself. It's really not a great start for the original Game Boy era of Pokemon, but things will pick up. The first console released in the Advanced era was just the Game Boy Advance. It can play all of the Pokemon games released before it in color and with the option for widescreen, but still, no backlit screen, Nintendo. Like, what's up with that? The cartridges also stick out a little bit, which is a bit awkward. The Game Boy Advance in general was a big leap from the original Game Boy despite this, and now you have access to Ruby, Sapphire, Emerald, Fire Red, and Leaf Green. Some of the best games in the entire series on a console with a nice form factor that's nice to hold. You still have a port to connect to the link cable that even works with the Generation 1 and 2 Pokemon games as well, something that we can't say about every console released after it. By today's standard, playing a normal GBA isn't the best, but not terrible. You still have to use AA batteries, which is annoying, but since it just plays more games than the original Game Boy, I'll put it in Z tier. It's just okay by today's standards. Actually, I want to put you above the N64 though, like that. And before moving on to the Game Boy Advance SP, we have to talk about the GameCube. The GameCube has this add-on called the Game Boy Player that pretty much turns your GameCube into a Game Boy so you can play it on your TV. Unlike the Super Game Boy or Pokemon Stadium, you have a link cable port this time to trade and do multiplayer, and it's mostly what I use when recording Game Boy Advance footage, and I even played on 2 separate GameCubes at once to play Ruby and Sapphire at the same time, to catch every Pokemon between both games, including version exclusives, controlled by a wireless controller with 2 receivers in each console so the inputs match both consoles, and I even included like trade evolutions and version exclusives to catch them all, for a Hoenn Pokedex video, and no, I am not insane. The only downside is you need a special disc to start up the Game Boy player on the GameCube. The one I have from my childhood is broken, and these discs can be pretty expensive. I got a Japanese GameCube just because the Japanese disc was so much cheaper than the North American one, and can still play any language Game Boy Advance game on it. The funny thing is, the disc is only needed at startup, so you could just take the disc out once the GBA game is running and still play your GBA game. And honestly, I just love the Game Boy player. I've used it a ton this year, and it's the best way to play Game Boy Advance or even original Game Boy games on your TV. The biggest drawback is you don't have access to speed up like you would in Pokemon Stadium for the Generation 1 games, but honestly, I would rather play Fire Red and Leaf Green anyway in normal speed compared to Red and Blue or Yellow in 2x speed. So yeah, GameCube, you're going in A tier. Which is right there. A couple of years after the Game Boy Advance release, they released the Game Boy Advance SP. What does SP stand for? Nobody knows. This was a foldable GBA with a rechargeable battery and finally a backlit screen, sort of. On older versions of the SP, the light comes from the side, so it's not technically a backlight, but it's still a light, so it counts for something, and it's much better than anything we had prior to it. I don't have any of the newer SPs with the updated backlight, and this is arguably the most popular and sought after console to play Pokemon on. It's a straight upgrade on top of the GBA that addresses the major issues, and over 20 years later, it still feels pretty good to play because you don't have to worry about batteries, and you can actually see the screen without relying on those silly accessories that barely worked. I'll also put the GBA SP in A tier. Newer models are a little bit better, but to keep things simple, which I rarely do, we'll just lump them together and put the SPs in A tier. So this might be controversial. I don't know what it is about me. I just don't really like the SP that much. I understand, like, objectively, great way to play Pokemon games, especially Gen 1, 2, and 3. I just don't really like the console. Like, I prefer the form factor of the regular GBA. I'm just an SP hater, I guess. Maybe it's because mine was stolen as a kid. That could be it. But trying to be unbiased for this one specifically, A tier. I will put it below the GameCube though and be a little biased. Then late into the GBA's life cycle, they released the Game Boy Micro. It's basically a mini GBA with some of the benefits the SP had, like a backlit screen and rechargeable battery. On paper, these are pretty cool, but there's a few flaws. As the name suggests, this thing is tiny and awkward to hold, but because of that, it has no backwards compatibility with the original Game Boy or Game Boy Color games, and no port for trading or battling. To be honest, there really isn't much of a reason to ever play a Game Boy Micro over an SP or regular GBA, or even a Game Boy Color, aside from the novelty. You could argue it's better than the original GBA because of the backlit screen, but you can also say it is worse because of the features that it's missing, so I'll also just stick it in C tier. I remember as a kid, I really wanted one of these, and I don't own one, but I've actually used one and played one before, and like, it's just like a novelty, like it's whatever. You are going under the N64. Sorry. Before I go on to the DS era, I want to talk about the Wii first, because you could technically play main series Pokemon games on the Wii. Although I'm sure like 99% of people watching this video have never played a Pokemon game this way. This also works with the GameCube, but there's a GameCube game called Pokemon Box, my second favorite box to your mother. However, this game was a bit weird. You could only get it at the Pokemon Center in Manhattan or online the Pokemon Center's website. This was over 20 years ago, so people didn't really buy things online nearly as much as they do today, and Pokemon Box was just a PC storage system akin to Pokemon Home, just offline on the GameCube or Wii because of backwards compatibility. This game fetches for over $2,000 today for its rarity in the secondary market, also making it the most expensive way to play Pokemon if you were to go out and get all of the stuff today. You could connect your GBA to your GameCube or Wii with a special GameCube to GBA cable, then play Ruby or Sapphire through Pokemon Box. Your Game Boy acts as the controller, and you have limited options compared to the Game Boy Player, although the Game Boy Player isn't compatible with the Wii, making this the only way to play main series Pokemon games on the Wii. It gets worse though, because this feature only lets you play Ruby and Sapphire, no other games. You could still transfer Pokemon from, say, Fire Red over to it, but you can't play Fire Red through it. It's also region locked, meaning you can't use it to play Japanese games if you're on a North American Wii, or in my case, I can't play my Italian copy of Pokemon Ruby on my American Wii. I might be the only person ever to have tried this, but this is one of the worst ways to play Pokemon because there's no reason to ever do this. It limits you to just 2 games, and it's also really expensive, so yeah, this is going in F tier. I'm also going to assume that this is the... Where'd my Wii go? I'm also going to assume that this is the way that people have played Pokemon the least, so yeah, F tier, below the Game Boy. Now, some people are probably going to point out how the Wii and GameCube could play Pokemon Colosseum and Pokemon XD Gale of Darkness. They aren't technically considered main series games, so I'm not going to count them for this video, but if I did, it really wouldn't change all that much for the Wii, as again, there's no reason to play Ruby and Sapphire on your Wii through Pokemon Box versus any other way of playing it. And now we have what some would consider peak, the Nintendo DS. First released in 2004, the original DS, or Fat DS as it's known today. I have 3 of them on my desk right here because I'm insane. This has not 1, but 2 backlit screens, a rechargeable battery that uses the same charger as the SP, which is a nice touch, a touch screen, and of course, a whole slew of Pokemon games to play on it. It's no secret that I am obsessed with the Nintendo DS. I have multiple DS Fats with capture cards like I said before, so I can go for my Shiny Torchic Platinum, which I actually got by the way, and here he is, good old Bert the Turd. This took over a year and a half, and now I'm going for Shinx, and I actually stream every Monday on Twitch at about 6 p.m. EST doing Shinies and Platinum, but back to the DS console itself. Goodbye, Bert. I'll see you Monday. It's definitely a chonker, but there's a whopping 9 main series Pokemon games on the DS alone, in addition to the 5 GBA games because of backwards compatibility. It doesn't support the Gen 1 and 2 games anymore, but seeing as those games were divided from Generation 3 games onward, it's not so bad. Also considering the fact that you have Fire Red and Leaf Green to play if you want to go through Kanto, and Heart Gold and Soul Silver if you want to go through Johto. Gens 3 through 5 are my favorite, so that weighs heavily here, but as great as the DS is, the DS Fat is the worst one in my opinion. It'll get the job done, but for any other game after Platinum, it'll run a bit slower, and even for Platinum, it'll run slower. It's not super noticeable, but I'm one of those weird Pokemon players who likes to play each game on the exact console it was intended for, and the Gen 5 games in particular were built for a better system in mind in the DSi. But before we get there, we need to discuss the DS Lite. Also, I'll put the DS Fat in B tier because it has wireless connectivity at the expense of the Gen 3 games losing connectivity, but at least you can still play those games with a nice screen that didn't lower its resolution too much. Yeah, so DS Fat, you can go right in the middle of B tier. The DS console most people had was the DS Lite. It came with a whole slew of colors, and I actually didn't own one of these until after the Switch came out. It's functionally the same as the DS Fat, but slimmer, hence the Lite name. The screens look a bit nicer, and the only drawback is it's a bit hard to hold because of its smaller size, and the GBA games stick out, which is kind of annoying. Not the worst compromise, but overall it's just better than the DS Fat. DS Lites aren't really too much more expensive than a DS Fat nowadays, so if you're looking to play DS games and GBA games, I highly recommend just going for the DS Lite. I'm gonna put the DS Lite at the top of A tier because as great as it is, there's actually a few ways that I think are better to play Pokemon. Although this next console, the base DSi, isn't one of them. The DSi isn't bad by any means. It's an updated DS that has some DSi enhanced games, notably Heart Gold, Soul Silver, the Gen 5 games, which run a bit better and are optimized for the DSi system. This means the DSi is the preferred system for those games, but it's really not that big of a deal. The DSi has a camera which serves no purpose for playing Pokemon. It has an actual home menu and interface with downloadable games like Pokemon Dream Radar, which isn't a main series game, but it ties into the Gen 5 main series games and isn't available on any previously released DS system, so it counts for something. The biggest drawback of the DSi is that it can't play GBA games at all, but for DS games alone, it's better than the DS Lite. Personally though, by today's standards, I'd rank the base DSi under the DS Lite, but still put it in the B tier, mainly because you don't have a GBA slot, although that screen is a nice screen, and it doesn't feel nearly as cheap as the DS Lite feels. I actually don't technically have a base DSi anymore, because I traded in my original one that I got at launch for a PS Vita, and then turned my Japanese DSi into paper, which, yeah, go watch that video, it's weird. But the DSi XL though, that is a real console. The DSi XL is one of the lesser known consoles on this list because not too many people outside of hardcore Pokemon players care for them. When it comes to buying a console for DS games, many people opt to go for the DS Lite or just a 3DS and often glance past the DSi XL, but this thing is a beast. So much so that I have 2 because I love them so much. You have the same things as the DSi, but a bigger screen that's much easier to hold and feels very comfortable. It's the console I mainly use when shining on DS games when I'm not streaming, and the build quality and material feels premium even to this day. It's seriously one of the best designed Nintendo consoles of all time. There's gonna be some bias here, of course, since I prefer to play DS games on my DSi XLs, and also because I prefer to play Pokemon games on their intended consoles, so I play my DSi XL a lot. And it's just my favorite, so S tier. Before I had my own DSi XL, I was software setting on a DS Lite for Turchwig, but since getting the DSi XL for the first time about a year ago, I barely use my DS Lite, and I blame you, Quick Panic, for always having multiple DSi XLs and letting me borrow one at a regional, and showing me the light of how much better these are. Then in 2011, 1 year after the DSi released, Nintendo released the 3DS. Now you can play your games in 3D, a feature that nobody uses, so much so that they released versions of the 3DS without any 3D. The 3DS has 8 exclusive Pokemon games for it, which can only be played on the 3DS. While these games are good, they aren't often seen as good as the 4th or 5th or even 3rd or 1st or 2nd generation for that matter, although the 3DS is backwards compatible for the DS games. There's a big issue with that though, like why do DS games look like this on the 3DS? They look blurry and stretched out, and while you could play it in normal resolution by holding down the start and select button at startup, now you have these weird black bars, which is even worse on the 3DS XL. Am I nitpicking? Yes. But this reason alone is why I don't like playing DS games on a 3DS. You could still do it if you really want to, and most people don't really care about this, but I do. The 3DS also introduced the virtual consoles where you could download Game Boy games on your 3DS. This includes all the Gen 1 and 2 Pokemon games with connectivity and is a huge part of all the 3DS consoles. With all this in mind, the original 3DS is still very solid. If you don't care about missing out on GBA games, want to play 3DS, DS games, and the original Game Boy games, then it really isn't a bad option, but similar to the DS Lite, it's a bit small and uncomfortable to hold. I'll throw it in B tier because there's a few better ways to play a 3DS. Actually interchangeable whether it would be above or below the DS Lite. I'll just put them next to each other because they're both definitely above the base DSi. There's also the 3DS XL, which is the same thing, but bigger. This makes a big difference because since getting a 3DS XL, I have no real reason to use my original launch 3DS and still use my blue 3DS XL to this day to play through my shiny only Alpha Sapphire challenge. I got Torchic months ago and I'm currently horde hunting for a Lotad. I have 20 hours of game time, by the way, and my only shiny is a Torchic. Haven't done this in a while. We're gonna do a live encounter. Come on, Surskit. Give me a shiny Lotad. One of these days, I've done so many encounters on stream or on screen for a video. One of these days I will get a shiny. Not today though. Also, random aside, Street Pass is freaking awesome. A big reason why I still play my 3DS XL over my new 3DS, which we'll talk about in a bit, is because I'm trying to get a Street Pass of all 50 states. So if you ever go to like a gaming convention or a Pokemon regional and I'm posting that I'm there and you're from like a state that I don't have, like Nebraska or Idaho, please come and bring your 3DS and Street Pass me. But yeah, the 3DS XL is just a better 3DS and it's a console that I play nearly every day, so solid A tier. I will put this above the DS Lite though. I think it's like pretty clear. I can also see the argument for putting the 3DS in the S tier, but there's better ways to play the 3DS and it's definitely not the 2DS. Why does this thing exist? It's a 3DS, but without the 3D. It doesn't fold, so you can't put it in your pocket, a staple of Nintendo consoles since the Game Boy Pocket. The only reason I still use this 2DS pretty regularly is because mine has a capture card, and it was just cheaper to get a 2DS with a capture card versus any other 3DS model with a capture card, and that's why mine has this weird box in the back. That's the capture card, and also the USB port. Not even USB-C, it's that old. The 2DS works, but it is the worst way to play 3DS games on, and DS games for that matter. I'm gonna stick it in the D tier because it at least gets the job done if you really need it, but any other way to play a DS game or a 3DS is significantly better. You know, I'm tired of moving stuff around. I'm just gonna put you on top of the Game Boy Light, whatever. 2DSs also used to be really cheap back in the day, like only 70 bucks or so, but with today's market and how expensive the 3DS has gotten, there's no reason to pick this over any other 3DS. I do want to give a shout out and some bonus points to the 3DS console of families though, for having some of the best special edition versions out of any Nintendo console. The X and Y themed 3DS XLs are gorgeous, and for the new 3DS, the Sun and Moon new 3DS is in my opinion the best looking 3DS console. I just got one, look how gorgeous that is. So that brings us to the new 3DS. What's new? This little nub right here. That's like an extra joystick. And Pokemon games don't even use that. Pokemon games run smoother on the new 3DS, which is most seen with the Generation 7 games. And honestly, the whole reason I even got a new 3DS XL was so I could replay Gen 7 again the best way possible. So once I get a capture card installed on that new 3DS, we'll do a video on that. I know I've been saying I want to make a video on Sun and Moon for like 2 years, but soon. Other than that, we have the new 3DS XL, the new 3DS, and the new 2DS XL. They're all very similar, with the main differences being that the new 3DS XL is bigger than the regular new 3DS, a regular new 3DS is bigger than an original 3DS, but not as big as an original 3DS XL, and the new 2DS XL is basically just a new 3DS XL without the 3D and a slightly different design, and the new 3DS not XL also has removable faceplates, which is kind of cool. Lots to unpack there, but in terms of playing Pokemon, they're all very similar, just have marginal differences. And honestly, if I have to pick one console that was the only console I could ever play Pokemon on again going forward, I think I would pick the new 3DS XL. Lately, I've been loving Shiny Hunting in Generation 6, which you can do on this. Want to replay Gen 7, which you can do on this. And while the DS games don't look amazing on it, I can still play Platinum on it and look at my shiny Turtwig on this new 3DS XL. So yeah, the new 3DS XL is going in S tier. They're incredible, and a weird small feature of them is that the cartridge actually goes in from the bottom. So here's something I didn't know actually. The new 2DS XL came out after the Switch came out, according to this. I found this on Reddit, by the way. I just Googled like every Nintendo console and this came up. There's of course a whole other world of the 3DS that makes them even better, but we're only talking about official releases straight out of the box and no other enhancements or non-Nintendo consoles that can technically play Pokemon game, as those would technically be the best, but don't tell Nintendo I said that. And now we have the modern era with the Nintendo Switch, one of the consoles that I play the least, but there are 10 main series games to choose from, including Legend ZA, and no backwards compatibility whatsoever. With a bit of an asterisk, I guess, because the Switch 2 is backwards compatible, but like, there's no Switch 2 exclusive Pokemon game yet, so we don't really know what that means. I'll talk about the Switch 2 later, I guess. We're gonna talk about the Switch 1 now. But the Switch Pokemon games aren't seen as some of the most liked games in the series, but it does have some solid variety at least. It really is a shame how this console is nearly a decade old, and despite having a bunch of Game Boy and Game Boy Advance games playable on the Nintendo Switch Online, there isn't a single Game Boy or GBA main series Pokemon game that could be played on it. Like, what's up with that, Nintendo? The Switch 1 itself is fine, but it always felt slightly underwhelming to me. It's cool being able to play on your TV or on the go at the same time, but it doesn't fit on your pocket anymore, so on the go doesn't really work too well for it, and the Switch is much more of a home console than a portable one. This was a big shift for Pokemon, as a big draw to Pokemon was being able to play on the go. Overall, I thought the Switch wasn't bad. I've had a lot of fun with it, but I'll stick it in B tier because it could be better. Also chat, don't make fun of my haircut. I know I'm like almost done with this video and I'm mentioning it now. I went to the barbershop, different barber was there, and they messed me up. So it is what it is. Oh, I forgot to give like a proper reasoning. Like the Switch 2 isn't bad. I'm putting it at the top of C tier though, because I think it's better than the GBA, but not better than anything in the B tier. There's also the Switch Lite though, which is a handheld only Switch. A really cool concept, and I'd love to get my hands on one for the novelty of it, but not being able to play on a TV and still not being able to easily fit it in my pocket is a shame. Plus, the Switch cartridges taste the worst out of any Pokemon cartridge. Why does this matter? It doesn't, but overall the Switch Lite is worse enough than the Switch to warrant it being in the C tier. I messed that up, hold on. Switch 1 goes, chat, we're a low budget show. It's just me around here, and Gravy who makes the thumbnail, shout out to Gravy. We're putting the Switch 1 at the bottom of B tier, so that way the Switch Lite can go at the top of C tier. The Switch Lite's not horrible, and if you don't have a Switch and only care about playing Pokemon and want to save some money, it's really not a bad option. And then, do I even rate the OLED Switch? It's basically just a Switch with a better screen, like that's literally it. There is no difference when it's docked, and so I guess overall it is slightly better than the Switch 1, but if you ask me, the OLED should have just been the base Switch model anyway, so it can stay in B tier, just slightly above the Switch. I'm not even gonna like bother adding it onto the thing because it's literally the same thing. Actually, you know what? Fine, I'll do it. It is slightly better, so it'll just go right there. And finally, the last console, the Switch 2. There's no exclusive Pokemon games for it yet, as Legend ZA is still on the Switch 1 and Switch 2, but it'll run better on the Switch 2, which is nice. In terms of Pokemon, the Switch 2 is more like what the new 3DS was compared to the original 3DS. It runs games better, especially Scarlet and Violet, which almost feel like completely different games on the Switch 2, and honestly should have just been released on the Switch 2. If you want to play modern Pokemon, the Switch 2 is easily the best way to play the modern Pokemon games. While I personally don't play the modern games that much, I still at least enjoyed all of the Switch Pokemon games enough, even you BDSP. And like I said before, this is the best way to play modern Pokemon, so I'll put it at the bottom of S tier for that fact alone. I'm sure that's a bit controversial, but if we were to factor in the quality of the Pokemon games on the system, then yeah, the Switch would be ranked a little bit lower. But since modern Pokemon games are the newest Pokemon games, that has to count for something. And in terms of how they feel, the Switch 2 feels so much better than the Switch 1. I also don't have a cutout for it, so I'm not gonna be super crazy, chat. I'm gonna take a Joy-Con, and I'm gonna do this. We'll put you in S tier. The Switch 2 Joy-Con will represent the Switch 2 because I didn't have a cutout of the Switch 2. It also doesn't fit in my pocket, so that's why it's at the lower end of S tier. So that's my tier list on consoles to play Pokemon on. The 3DS family of consoles are clearly the winners, just don't get a 2DS. A lot of this has to do with how it feels playing in the current year, which is why a lot of the older consoles didn't fare so well. So there's my tier list. What do you think? Do you hate it? Probably.